My opponent has come here to tell you that capitalism does offer some hope for you in the future. And I have come here to tell you that capitalism does not offer any hope for you in the future. So you will be able to listen to my opponent's specific evidence when she starts to speak after I finish. Now, my opponent is a prophet of hope. She belongs to the school of complacent illusion, which looks upon the chaos which surrounds us in society at the moment and sees within it a manifestation of the most ordered civilization conceivable to mankind. Let's take a look at this civilization, because it's that which my opponent has to defend. At the moment in Britain, there are over 100,000 officially homeless families. And there are even more thousands of people living in homes which lack basic amenities such as toilets and baths. But my opponent is very hopeful. She hopes that the brick surplus, which at the moment is higher than at any time since 1939, will one day be used to build houses. She hopes that the empty homes, of which there are even more in Britain than there are homeless families, will one day be lived in. She hopes that the hundreds of thousands of unemployed building workers, the highest number on record, will one day be given work to construct houses. 30 million people starve to death each year. That equals 1 person per second on average. That amounts to the equivalent of 1 Hiroshima every 3 days. But they're dying in a world which is quite capable of feeding every living being several times over. Nevertheless, my opponent is hopeful that capitalism will feed the starving millions. She hopes that the beef and butter mountains, the wine and milk lakes, will one day feed those who need them. She hopes that the American government, which is currently paying farmers not to produce wheat, because according to the perverse economic laws of capitalism, there is overproduction of wheat, too much food for the market demand. She hopes that one day the American farmers will again be producing wheat so that people can eat it. People are suffering, and they are dying in many cases, for lack of access to basic health facilities. But they will be relieved to learn that my opponent is very hopeful about the future. She hopes that the people will have access to kidney machines and will not have to die because it is costing too much to keep them alive. She hopes that not too many casualty departments will be closed down because it's economically rational within capitalism to close down hospitals and let people go without basic health attention. During the recent cold spell, hundreds of people in London and other cities in this country alone died. And they died of a socially created disease which is called hypothermia. And some of you may think hypothermia means a disease of not having enough heat. It is in fact a disease of not having enough money to obtain heat. And as people died because they lacked the money to put on a heater, my opponent sincerely hopes that it won't happen again. She hopes that the Electricity Board, which has cut back on production in 1982 because there's not enough market demand for electricity, she hopes that in future we will be able to provide for everyone's energy needs. Millions of people are unemployed. Whole districts which were once the key areas of industrial production have been compelled to cease producing wealth. They've been scrapped. But my opponent has a message for the millions of unemployed people. Have hope, she says. Have hope, get on your bicycles, go up and down the motorways, stop off at all of the cities, and as you pass through the socially created wastelands of an advanced industrial society, have hope, she says, because capitalism will give them jobs. And indeed, capitalism may give them jobs, just as her counterparts in the 1930s in the Conservative Party, they said in 1932, 50 years ago, have hope, we'll give you all a job, and they kept their promise. In 1939, everyone was given a job to go out killing people, but they weren't given very much hope. And once again, the prospect of world war grows from a possibility into a probability. The British government alone spends £1.5 million per hour. Governments of the world spend $200 million per year, billion dollars rather, per year. And my opponent's response to all of this, my opponent's response as we advance down the road towards a Holocaust, is to read her copy of Protect and Survive and to have hope about the prospects of not being blown up in another war. After all, my opponent's representative in the government, Mr. John Nott, has told her personally that the bombs are only being produced to preserve peace. So have hope. Have hope if you're surrounded by bombs. And when the fuse is lit, when the weapons of destruction are put into devastating use, my opponent will die hoping that her imaginary God has reserved a place for her in his imaginary kingdom of heaven. But of course, my opponent is not really a prophet of hope at all. All this talk about optimism and about happy futures and about rationally organised societies, my opponent dismisses all of this as a lot of socialist idealism. She is a conservative, and therefore she doesn't go in for all of this visionary nonsense about living in a rational society where food is produced for people to eat and houses are produced for people to live in. She doesn't go in for all this nonsense about old people being able to switch on the heater when there is adequate electricity and energy supplies to keep them warm. Because my opponent, being a conservative, idolises the greatest conservative philosopher of them all, whose name, she's probably never heard of him, that is the standard of conservatives these days, Edmund Burke. And Edmund Burke wrote in 1770 about what all conservatives should demand from capitalism. He said, "The great body of the people must not find the principles of natural subordination rooted out of their minds. They must respect that property of which they cannot partake. They must labour to obtain what by labour can be obtained. And when they find, as they commonly do, the success disproportionate to the endeavour, they must be taught to console themselves with the prospect of divine justice." And that is the confidence trick which my opponent wants to try on you. Accept the principles of natural subordination and inequality. And that is why every time I meet a conservative, I say to myself, here comes another Burke. And of course, my opponent accepts what Burke is saying because she believes in this anachronistic system of inequality. She actually accepts that there should be rich people and there should be poor people. There'll be people who can have the best that society can provide, and there are people who must have the worst or nothing at all. There are people who can have good food, and there are people who must starve. There are people who must have decent houses, and there are people who can have no houses at all. They openly defend this system where 10% of the population in Britain owns more of the accumulated wealth than the poorest 90% put together, where the richest 1% owns more of the wealth than the poorest 80%. And what's more, they have the audacity to call it a property-owning democracy. They openly defend the profit system, where people can only have access to vital goods and services if they are prepared to pay money to somebody who has not helped to produce those goods and services, if they are prepared to provide rent, interest and profit, the holy trinity of conservatism. And they make no apologies whatsoever for the fact, it'd be very encouraging if she doesn't make an apology for the fact, but she won't, that a small elite of multinational corporations are in a position to monopolise the major industrial concerns of our society. In fact, they call this system of monopoly free enterprise. And from the point of view of those who are in a position of unearned affluence and privilege, my opponent's hope for capitalism has much to be said for it. Because why shouldn't they continue to send their kids to the best schools? Why shouldn't they continue to reserve the best hospitals for themselves? Why shouldn't they reserve the best houses for them to live in? Why shouldn't they use the newspapers as media for their voices and their interests? Of course! Why should they feed starving people when it will result in a cut in their profits? Why should they build houses for people to live in when people can't afford to pay for mortgages? Why should they disarm when they have foreign markets and raw materials to compete for? So as a socialist, as a Marxist, I do not intend this afternoon to argue that the capitalist class should organise their system in anything but the insane and chaotic and antisocial way that they do. Indeed, my analysis of the capitalist system is that that is precisely what it is in their interest to do, and they must, and they certainly will, go on doing it. I leave it to the naive idealists who want to humanise capitalism to explain in detail how they are going to do it. That's all we want to know. How are they going to do it? And I would advise you to listen very carefully to what my opponent has to say in a few minutes. Listen to her defence of capitalism, because I predict you'll hear a lot of pious rhetoric about freedom and about the nation and about the right of the individual, and you'll not hear a single practical idea about how to turn capitalism into a system which works in the interests of the vast majority who do not monopolise capital. Because the fact is that capitalism offers no hope for the majority of people. They have tried reforming it. You've had the Tory government using every means at their disposal to reform capitalism. You've had the poor man's Tory party, which they call the Labour Party, doing their job for them when they're not in office. They've listened to the wisdom of John Maynard Keynes. And according to John Maynard Keynes, you could create a capitalist system where there would be perpetual full employment, where there would never be another war. And they fell flat on their faces. They have swallowed the absurd dogma of monetarism, which they discovered in the basement of an American university. And look at the catastrophe that has arisen from this absurd experiment. In Russia, in Poland, they have tried to do what cannot be done, to use the state to control capitalism in the interest of the working class. Just as Tory and Labour governments have done in their various nationalisation plans here. And it is an utter and appalling failure. Because you cannot take a system which has to run in the interest of capital and convert it into a system which is going to run in the interest of the majority. You have to scrap it. But, in conclusion, as we debate this question of what hope capitalism offers for the future, in 1982, the capitalist system is not only hopeless, it is positively harmful. It is at the moment, as a system, going through a period of crisis. And these crises are endemic to capitalism. And what is the crisis that it's going through? The current crisis of capitalism, you would think, if you looked at it logically, that it was a crisis of underproduction. That they can't produce enough food, they can't produce enough cars, they can't produce enough houses. Not at all. Technologically, it could be done tomorrow. Capitalism is going through a crisis of overproduction. they have produced too much for demand. And what they mean by demand isn't what any sensible person would mean that by demand. It doesn't mean that people need things, people want things. It means people cannot afford to buy them. The markets are glutted. And in the battle for new markets, the safety of humanity is seriously imperiled. Only a rogue or a lunatic could possibly observe with smugness the onward march towards World War III that this intensifying competition over markets in a period of crisis is involving us in. And if you support my opponent, you are doing more than making a casual ideological commitment to one side or the other. Don't think that if you happen to have one personality defect, you can support the Tories, and if you have another, you support the SDP, and if you have a more serious one, you become a Marxist. It's not like that at all. It's not a question of your personality or your aims or your ideological commitments. If you support the system which my opponent is about to defend, then what you are doing is supporting the perpetuation of not only the cause of mass poverty today, but possibly the cause of mass annihilation tomorrow. Because destruction is the only way out of the crisis, which capitalism knows. In the 1880s, it went through a massive crisis. In 1914, you had the solution to it. In the 1930s, its second major crisis. In 1939, you had the solution to it. And precisely the same pattern is being replicated today. Now, the socialist alternative to this historical pattern is based upon the principle of social creation rather than destruction. Because what socialists are advocating is a society where production is based upon need and not upon profit. Sounds very simple. It sounds very simple indeed. But consider the transformation of society that is involved in that principle. No longer do you cease producing wealth because it's not profitable for the minority who own the means of production and distribution. You produce because people want things. You use social technology to provide for useful human needs. And socialists advocate a society of democratic common ownership of the means of wealth production, instead of either private or state ownership. Instead of a society which is either controlled by a dictatorship of the boardroom or a dictatorship of a bureaucracy. And socialists advocate a world where all people have free access to wealth, instead of a market system where those who cannot afford to pay must suffer deprivation. I understand why Tories never bloody learn anything. They always talk when their opponents are speaking to them. Because for the Conservative, society has reached the peak of its achievement. It has reached its historical destiny. History stopped at the moment that my opponent was born. We've got capitalism, we've got all the problems, and that's as far as she's prepared to go. But capitalism, according to them, is the embodiment of civilization. For the socialist, there is no hope in the capitalist system. There is immense danger in the capitalist system. And we will not waste our time reforming the capitalist system. We want a world where everything that is in the world belongs to the people of the world and not to the people of the stock exchange. And with respect to what my opponent is going to say, we will certainly not be deterred in that aim by the blinkered hopes of historically retarded advocates of conservatism.
I find it very amusing that my opponent apparently predicts everything that I'm going to say, but he's right about some things and not about others. For a start, I do resent the imputation as I know nothing about birth. Anyway, I find it very interesting that Conservatives should be called upon to defend capitalism as though it were our ideology, just as Marxism is the ideology of this Socialist Party. British conservatism is not ideological, or an ism, or a system of ideas, because there is a crucial distinction between an ideology and a theory. One can hold a theory which is not ideological and which distrusts abstract thought. Conservative theories are grounded in experience and may change with circumstance. We do not believe in a creed of abstract truths, as my friend here does, as any attempt to put a political ideology into practice implies dictatorship and force. And this is why we cannot tolerate Marxism. Free life is not tidy, and human beings, if left to themselves, do not fit into a system. They have to be coerced. And this is so, however much the system, or the people who wish to impose it, claim to be embodying or creating liberty. When a regime is by definition regarded as recognising rights and freedoms, the citizen becomes deprived of any right to complain that he is being deprived of his rights and liberties. Indeed, any system or utopia is almost by definition tyrannical. If a state is run in the best possible way, according to infallibly true and beautiful principles, Marxism, then clearly nobody must be allowed to change them, for any change must be denounced. It must be wrong, it must be for the worse. It must be licence, or fascism, or folly, or counter-revolution, or subversion, or perhaps bourgeois selfishness. And it must be suppressed, so that the utopian bliss of the perfect system can prevail undisturbed. No socialist country in the world is free. Wherever free enterprise has been eliminated, dictatorship has followed. Common sense shows us that this must be so. If the state is the only employer, who can defy it? In a country where the sole employer is the state, said Trotsky, not without experience, opposition means death by slow starvation. If all economic power is concentrated in the state, or in the Democratic People's Republic, or whatever you care to call it, it boils down to the state in the end, there could be no countervailing power. And without this, there can be no restraint on the government, and therefore there can be no freedom. An all-powerful state is an all-powerful state. It's as simple as that. And these truths are not the result of a Russian perversion of Marxism, or a Stalinist perversion of Leninism. As the 19th century anarchist Bakunin said, those previous workers, having just become rulers, will represent not the people, but themselves. He who doubts it does not know human nature. Now, the reason that there is a future in capitalism is quite simple. No form of government, apart from that, can possibly entail personal freedom and liberty. Freedom is not an abstract ideal, it is a concrete thing, and its existence or absence can be established by tests. For instance, freedom to own property, freedom to worship as one wishes, freedom to change government. In other words, capitalism and conservatism are concerned with certain definite liberties, rather than an abstract condition of liberty. Now, the existence of freedom in England does not depend on parliamentary government or anything else, but the absence of any overwhelming concentrations of power in our society. All other freedoms depend on this one condition of freedom. Power is dispersed among a multitude of organisations within our society: the government, the opposition, CBI, trade unions. And it's this diffusion and non-concentration of power in the hands of any single body, only achieved through capitalism, that makes this country free. Now, ownership diffuses power, and so a right to private property is the form of government most favourable to liberty. If there is no private property, there will be no freedom. The state will be unchallengeable and supreme. Private property also protects the family, which is the natural social unit and the primary support of the individual. Because the bonds of the family are so strong, many tyrants collect the seen as their enemy and try to disrupt it. Modern dictatorships try to make children inform against their parents. In the capitalist reaction against state control, the family plays a very important role. Therefore, we want the maximum number of people to own as much property as possible. The creation of a property-owning democracy is a good in itself, as no other form of democracy will long survive. One of the main ways of spreading property in Britain today, and to reverse the concentration of power in the state, is to allow council tenants to buy their own houses. Capitalists also favour inherited wealth, although they appreciate that such wealth must be taxed. As more and more people, as a result of capitalist policies, come to own their own property, it is taken as axiomatic that the owners of these houses should be allowed to leave them to their children. We cannot see that it is right for a man to earn money for himself, wrong to earn it for his children. Indeed, anyone who does not believe that the nation is merely a conglomerate of atomised individuals is bound to favour some transition of wealth and possessions from one generation to another. Private property and wealth is also the greatest barrier to monopoly, and all monopolies are infringements of liberty. We believe that no individual, no group, no association or union can be entrusted with so much power, and that it is pointless to complain once absolute power has been established and abused. It exists to be abused. In consequence, we have faith only in arrangements which are hostile to monopoly and absolute power, such as competition. By this, we mean the establishment of effective competition wherever it is possible, and the suppression of all monopolies, including labour monopolies. We attempt to counter Marxism, not by counter-speculation about class, labour and capital. Facts are more telling than abstractions. We can point to the undoubted truths that private enterprise economics are much more efficient than socialist economics, that the capitalist West gives far more aid to third-world countries than the starving millions than does the Eastern Bloc in any country that calls itself socialist, and that while freedom is the likely outcome of a free enterprise economy, tyranny is the inevitable outcome of a fully socialist state. We proceed empirically, and remember that society is not a laboratory for social experiments. I don't think I need to apologise for capitalism. I think it speaks for itself. Anything else is utopian. Capitalism has its faults. All societies have their faults. But I think a society that lets the individual express himself to the best of his ability is probably the best one for us.